These are your guided notes for adapting to the environment and also the interactions among living things. The first thing we're going to talk about is the difference between natural selection and adaptations. And I know in your WOG quiz that was difficult, those were two difficult terms for you to know the difference between. So we're going to take a look at that today. So natural selection, what is it? It's a characteristic that makes an individual better suited to its environment, that may eventually become common in that species through a process called natural selection. So go ahead and make a little cloud around the word process. Okay, if you make a little cloud around the word process, because that is the key term that differentiates between natural selection and adaptation. So this is how the natural selection works. Individuals whose unique characteristics are best suited for their environment tend to survive and produce offspring, which is our fancy science word for babies. So natural selection then results in adaptations. Now, adaptations are the behaviors and physical characteristics that allow organisms to live successfully in their environments. So the difference between natural selection and adaptation is that natural selection is that process that an organism goes through to gain the adaptation, which is the behavior or physical characteristic that actually allows that organism to live successfully in their environment. So let's have a hypothetical situation. Let's say, let's relate this back to school. Let's say that there's always students that come in at the beginning of the year, think they're the baddest bad kid in town, and they like to put their feet up on the table, they don't like to do work, they like to mouth off to the teacher. Well, whenever they come into Mrs. Williard's room, they might try to do those cool things, things that they think are cool, like mouthing back or having an attitude or not trying to do any work. Well, whenever Mrs. Lawyer corrects them, they have to sign the book, and Mrs. Lawyer lets them know that's not how it works in this room. They're going through that process of natural selection, so because they're getting to the point where they're going to have a behavioral adaptation where they learn the ropes, that's not how it works, and then they adapt behaviorally to the expectations within Mrs. Williard's classroom. So eventually in the year, they're going to be able to do the work, be respectful, and be responsible. So there are also some students that might not ever adapt behaviorally. And those students then, um, in nature, would be subject to what happens whenever they don't adapt at all. So in nature, if you have poor characteristics, that's going to make you less successful and you're going to die. So in the school scenario, you don't die necessarily. It's more like you're getting expelled. So that's how we're going to relate this back to school. So if you don't adapt behaviorally at school, then you're expelled. And in nature, if you don't adapt behaviorally or physically so you can live successfully in your environment, then those individuals with poorly suited characteristics are less likely to survive, and then these characteristics may then disappear from the species over time because they're not living long enough to be able to produce the offspring that the organisms who have adapted and have good behaviors and physical characteristics are then able to live successfully and then produce their offspring to continue their species and those traits. So that's the difference between adaptations and natural selection. Natural selection is that process of getting a behavioral or physical adaptation. We also have different prey adaptations. So prey, they try to maybe have a behavioral or physical adaptation to make sure that they're not going to be eaten by a predator. So for example, you have mimicry up in the top corner. So mimicry is whenever you try to look like or act like another organism. And up here you think that, oh, it looks like a snake, but actually this is a caterpillar. And so organisms that would typically eat caterpillars would stay away because they think it's a snake instead of a caterpillar. You also have protective coverings like this pangolin, which is an African mammal, and it has scales on the outside, so that's a physical adaptation. It also, when it feels threatened, rolls itself up into a ball, and that's more of a behavioral adaptation. You could have false coloring, like with this moth, and with this moth, if you're in the dark rainforest, the coloring that it has on its wings makes it look like the eyeballs of a mammal. And any predators that might have originally tried to eat that moth would stay away because it thinks it's a much larger mammal. You also have camouflage. And camouflage is probably something that's more familiar to you. Um, this is a walking leaf. You might have seen walking sticks at your house, and they blend into the leaves on the trees or leaves that are even on the ground so that the predator does not see it. You also have warning colors, which is a physical adaptation where this is a grasshopper and it has very bright colors. It indicates that this insect is poisonous. You might also see things like this on frogs. Okay, let's move on to the next part. The next part we're going to talk about is a niche. Niche rhymes with snitch. And the niche is the role of an organism in its habitat, or how it makes its living. So that's called its niche. And a niche is a special role that these organisms play so that they can live and survive. Everybody has a special role, I'm sure, in their family. Like maybe you're the funny one, or the one that always gets in trouble, or the smart one, or the athletic one. But I bet if you thought about it, you probably have a special role in your family, and that's your niche. So organisms and their habitats also have a niche. And a niche includes these 5 different categories. They could be classified by the type of food the organism eats. So type of food organism eats. It could be classified by how it obtains food. It could be classified by which other organisms eat it. So which organisms eat it as a source of food. When and how it reproduces. So maybe they have live babies, maybe they lay eggs, maybe it takes a long time, maybe it takes a few weeks. And also physical conditions required to survive. So physical conditions to survive. Like before, when we were talking about how a prairie dog cannot survive on a rocky ocean shore or in a rainforest, how it's very specific to those conditions on a prairie for that prairie dog to survive. That's its niche. Okay, this is the end of the first part. The next part is going to be talking about the interactions between organisms. If you need to hear any of this again, please feel free to rewind.